Hey everyone, Delve here. Today I'm going to go over the Marksman skill in max difficulty Oblivion. Marksman is actually one of the better skills in the game for max difficulty, although in typical Oblivion fashion, it will require a decent amount of setup. Additionally, I'll be covering the skill Sneak as well, as it is thematically appropriate. This character is yet another character capable of leveling up, even throughout the process, and I found it to be one of the more fun and easy characters to play, so I highly recommend it, and special thanks to the Old Knight for teaching me this technique. For a race, the optimal choice is actually probably Wood Elf, believe it or not, as Wood Elves start with the high Marksman skill, Sneak skill, and Alchemy skills. I went with Orc for reasons I will explain later, and it's a decent enough choice, but not really optimal. Unfortunately, most of the race options are generally terrible, and most max difficulty setups get a lot easier with a specific race, but this is one of the situations where your race basically doesn't matter. Also, this is another character who is going to be making use of restoration, so I recommend leveling up right from the start with that. For the tutorial itself, Sneak and Archery are actually decent enough skills, since you can easily get sneak attacks and kite enemies effectively. However, you will face a bottleneck in terms of the number of arrows you possess. The tutorial simply doesn't have enough arrows in it. For that reason, I opted to use Destruction Magic just for the tutorial, but you also could very easily just sneak or run past a lot of the goblins. While we were talking about the tutorial, this is a good opportunity to level up your stealth, even all the way to 100. Most of the rats are non-hostile, but there are 3 rats fighting or fleeing from the zombie, and these rats remain non-hostile even after the zombie is dead. Because of this, as long as you move around behind them, you can very easily raise your sneak skill. Now the question is whether or not this is worth doing at all, and the answer is maybe. It's certainly not required, so I didn't do it necessarily, but it may make your life slightly easier. Ultimately, however, you aren't really relying on Sneak as a skill, it merely improves and augments an already strong strategy. For Burst Sign, you simply won't need any of them, so technically the optimal choice is probably the Thief for extra speed and luck. I went with the Shadow, which is a power that grants 60 seconds of invisibility. Now, I've relied very heavily on invisibility in the previous videos, so I really don't want invisibility to be the star of the show here. Invisibility doesn't even really synergize with Marksman, because notching an arrow and trying to pull it back actually breaks the invisibility, so it's kind of not really usable. But I did use it several times when I ran out of arrows, so I was pretty glad that I took it. Now, this is your first warning that if you are using Marksman at all, you really don't want to run out of arrows if you can avoid it, as that will potentially cripple your ability to keep going and you may need to go back to town and buy arrows. So that's a huge pain. Don't bother with that. For class, your specialization is either magic or stealth. Magic specialization will make the setup faster, so it's probably objectively superior, but I went with stealth specialization so that I could level Sneak and Marksman faster, since most of the schools of magic we need are actually pretty easy to level up. Favorite attributes is your choice between intelligence, speed, and luck. This is not optional. You must pick 2 of these 3 basically, in my opinion, because you actually don't want any of the remaining stats, although I guess you could also go personality if you wanted to as well, except that it's kind of bad. But you definitely don't want strength, willpower, agility, or endurance. Your skills here are fairly crucial. I recommend Alchemy, Alteration, Armor, Marksman, Mercantile, Restoration, and Sneak. Most of these are really convenient to have, and I don't generally recommend any other skills. I actually went with Destruction instead of Armorer here, not for any offensive magic or anything like that, but just in case I needed it for the setup of the main trick. I didn't end up needing it, so I don't recommend it. Instead of Armor or Mercantile, you could also consider taking Mysticism. It's not particularly useful, but the Detect Life spell is a nice tool for any character based on stealth, as it will reveal enemies. Okay, now we've gotten the tutorial out of the way, it's time to go over the main trick. Marksman is pretty much useless against most enemies, doing very little damage. The game is simply impossible to complete, even when factoring in sneak attack bonuses. So we'll need to get a trick going to make our damage better, and for that we'll need to start leveling our alchemy. Now, in the previous series of videos, I went over the infinite money trick where you can sell alchemy tools in the mages guilds, wait for them to respawn in the cabinets, and then sell them again. Leveling alchemy is the other easy way to make gold, and all the while you are of course also leveling your alchemy skill. Just go to the various inns throughout the world. I recommend the Oak and Crozier in Coral, as well as the 2 inns in the Imperial City Elven Garden District, and lastly the Feed Bag and the Merchant's Inn in the Imperial City Market District. From these vendors you'll want to buy all the food items priced 2 to 4 gold, and then systematically convert those into Restore Fatigue potions that you will then sell to any alchemy merchant. Each potion ends up being sold for a profit, so you end up steadily making gold while leveling your alchemy. Then, you just go someplace far away, wait for 2 days, and then all those inns will have restocked their items, and you can repeat the process. You want to largely stay away from alchemy vendors for ingredients. They aren't bad per se, but they tend to have fancier ingredients that are less easy to turn into potions, so your bag will get filled with alchemy ingredients that are tougher to make use of in the short term. As you level your alchemy skill, this problem will basically go away, because you'll unlock new effects for the alchemy ingredients, but it's still not an efficient use of your time to bother with them in general, unless you are looking for specific ingredients. It makes much more sense to reset the inns instead. Now, this video is not a guide for alchemy, or all the things that alchemy can do for you. Personally, I don't actually much care for alchemy itself. I find it kind of fiddly and inconsistent unless you are willing to farm vast amounts of specific ingredients, or go to vendors over and over again. For that reason, we're going to use alchemy about the minimum amount we can get away with, and there's really not that much use this character can get out of it anyway, even if we really wanted to. I'll cover alchemy more broadly and in more detail later. This video is more about one really specific trick and how to set it up using alchemy. With that being said, another really good effect you can get from alchemy is, of course, invisibility. So it's an easy sub for illusion magic in that way, and that's about as much as I'll say on alchemy overall. Either way, for the purpose of the trick, we will have to understand how alchemy works a little bit. For starters, that is that at 25, 50, and 75 alchemy, you'll progressively unlock the various alchemy effects. This will make it easier to brew potions overall, and we'll need at least 75 alchemy to be able to get access to all the effects we want, so be prepared to spend an hour or two making potions. Similarly, I wouldn't worry about alchemy equipment at all. All you really need to be doing is jamming ingredients together to hit that 75 alchemy. Once you've reached 75 alchemy, the effects we are looking for are damage strength, damage willpower, damage agility, and damage endurance. You will be able to get some of those effects before 75 alchemy, but for the damage strength effect in particular, you will require 75 alchemy, and before 75 alchemy, the rest of these effects are tougher to make potions of anyway, so I don't really necessarily recommend worrying too much about them until you have 75 alchemy. For damage strength, you want bread loaf and leek primarily, which can easily be obtained from most inns. For damage agility, you'll want bread loaf, cheese wedge, corn, pumpkin, and rice, and for damage endurance, you want carrot and radish. There's also a lot of alchemy vendor ingredients that have this effect, so you can check those as well. And for damage willpower, you will need to see alchemy vendors for exotic ingredients as well, as this effect has no food items. Luckily, there are a decent number of ingredients for this effect, such as morning glory root pulp, scales, and wisp stock caps. Alchemy vendors tend to have a good number of these on hand. Ordinarily, these damage attribute effects are poisons, which means they can only be applied to weapons and then used on enemies. But by combining ingredients that also have a positive effect, they can also be made into potions that just happen to have a damage attribute side effect. For strength and agility in particular, this is extremely easy to do since the main ingredients are food items, which means they automatically come with the restore fatigue effect as well as the relevant damage attribute effect. For damage endurance and damage willpower, you can pretty easily brute force it by finding the two relevant ingredients and then just tacking on one or two extra food items to easily give it that restore fatigue effect. Our goal here is to drain all four of those stats, strength, willpower, agility, and endurance, all the way to 0. Now before you drain your strength stat, it is imperative that you buy a feather effect from the Alteration School, the easiest place to buy a feather spell being the Cheydinhal Mages Guild. Draining your strength is going to reduce your carry weight, so if you drain it to 0, you will essentially be stuck in place without a feather effect. Feather itself is kind of lame. It doesn't actually increase your equip load. All it does is make the items in your inventory weigh nothing, so you may need to recast it every time you pick something up. But it is also an extremely cheap spell effect, and the default spells that can be bought from vendors are more than good enough to beat the entire game with. You may want to consider training your alteration skill as well, so that these are easier to cast and you can hold on to more stuff. Once that's squared away, it's time to drop all 4 stats to 0. Well, technically, our goal is to have a base fatigue of exactly 1, which means we actually want 1 of the 4 stats at 1 and the rest at 0. The easiest way to do this is to drop them all down to 0 and then level up and choose to increase one of our stats by 1. So you'll obviously want to bank 1 level up just for this step. Speaking of our level ups, do not increase any of these stats ever again, or you'll have to repeat the setup and you don't need any of them anyway. Every time you level up, you only want to increase either intelligence, speed, personality, or luck. At very high levels, this character could become kind of awkward to play since you'll have to increase those bad stats once the others are maxed out, but that never happened to me and is unlikely to ever affect you if you're just playing normally, and you'd probably need to have a character well into the 30s or 40s before that became an issue. It's important to understand that you cannot pray at shrines with this character. Doing so will restore your stats and break the setup, so you'll have to do it all over again. This will lock you out of some quests, notably one of the early Knights of the Nine quests, and possibly some others, so if you catch a disease, you will have to cure it using Alchemy. In the event that something else messes up this setup, you can consider using the Drain attribute effect. This is a destruction effect and is otherwise fairly tough to obtain unless you play as an orc, although there are quests that will grant you this effect as well. You can make a custom spell on self to drain your attributes. Unfortunately, it's a pretty expensive effect overall, so it's really only viable to cast on yourself if you are only knocking a handful of points off. You also can't make a custom spell that drains less than 3 points at a time, so while it can be easily used to drain a stat to 0, it can also be difficult to drain a stat just to 1. Fortify attribute has the same issue. It basically can't be used at all for this setup because you can, at minimum, fortify an attribute by 3 points. If you are really high level and have really high alchemy level equipment, such as the Master Alembic, you can make potions with extremely weak negative effects, such as damage strength by 1 point for 1 second. So you can also probably work your stats down back to 1 that way if you need to with those really granular high level potions. For my playthrough, I never had to resort to any of this, so I wouldn't worry too much about it, but if something does go wrong, you will have ways of fixing this setup. Lastly, I'll briefly touch on negative stats, which can also be used to get you down to 1 max fatigue. Negative stats subtract from your total fatigue, so with low enough negative stats, you could hypothetically have other stats higher than 1, so maybe you have your agility negative, you have your strength negative, or willpower negative, something like that. The only way I know of to drop your stats negative is to use the absorb attribute spell, and then drink a damage attribute potion, but be aware that once your stats are negative, I wasn't able to subsequently drain them further, so I got to -5 agility and then couldn't go any lower. So it's a little awkward to use. In any case, would probably require a really high restoration skill to really make use of, since absorb attribute is a restoration skill. So I don't really recommend doing this at all. Furthermore, driving your stats into the negative can cause other problems. Stats like willpower might further lower your magicka regeneration if you were to drive the stat into the negative, for example, and at 0 willpower, your magicka regeneration is already kind of on the low side, so it probably doesn't seem like a good idea to me. And lastly, the easiest place to do this is in Peryite's Shrine in the middle of nowhere, so that's a huge hassle as well, and again, I just don't recommend it. I don't think it's worth it compared to just damaging your own stats down to 0, but it is an interesting foible of the trick that it's even possible, but not really very useful. Okay, now that that's out of the way, the last thing you'll need to make it work is a Fortify Fatigue spell, and 2 of these can easily be obtained from Edgar's discount spells in the Imperial City. And these are restoration spells, so hopefully you've been leveling that as well. You will want both of these, as you can stack them together, and Fortify Fatigue is a really cheap spell effect, so it shouldn't be too much trouble to cast at this point. So what am I getting at here? Why drain our stats to the point where we only have 1 point of base fatigue? Well, it comes down to the damage formula and how damage from weapons like bows and swords are calculated. Here's the equation, and it doesn't really matter too much for our purposes, other than to say that having a fatigue of 1 and then fortifying it by 50 points will basically multiply our damage by 50 times. Now, if we were to have a max fatigue of 2 and fortify it by 50 points, it will multiply our damage by 25 times, so you can still sort of pull this trick off even if you have a fatigue slightly higher than 1. But it's easy enough to hit 1 fatigue that I wouldn't bother dealing with 2 or 3 fatigue if you can avoid it. That's just reducing your damage considerably. Keep in mind that this will not work with a base fatigue of 0. So if you get all your stats to 0 and then don't raise 1 by 1, it won't work, at least as far as I can tell. You must have a max fatigue of 1 or more. So, to recap the overall trick once again, first we get a feather spell, then we use alchemy to drop our stats to 0, then we level up and put 1 point into strength so that we have a max fatigue of 1, and then we fortify our fatigue to multiply our damage by that amount. Again, having a max fatigue of 0 will not work. You must have a max fatigue of 1 or more. Okay, so that's the entire trick and most of the relevant ideas and techniques. Again, the end result is a damage multiplier of 75 times, assuming you are using the default Fortify Fatigue spells from the vendor in the Imperial City. This is then multiplied by either 2 times or 3 times whenever you successfully get a sneak attack, which makes it even stronger. Because of your low strength, you will constantly need to be casting feather effects, but they're not expensive and they last a long time, and you also can get an enchanted piece of gear with feather on it as well. I went with the Grey Fox's Hood from the Thieves Guild questline, and this also comes with a powerful Detect Life enchantment on it as well, which is nice for stealth-based characters. Now the 75 times damage bonus is considerable, and even with relatively low marksman skill and basic bows and arrows, you'll still be able to comfortably defeat surprisingly difficult endgame enemies or near endgame enemies like Zivalai, Storm Atronach, and so on. Bows are exceptionally helpful in this regard, as you can fire at a range and dodge enemy spells or arrows, or kite melee enemies backwards. Because of this, you can pretty readily get away with being fragile and weak, even if it takes 5 or more arrows to kill some enemies. I highly recommend searching for better bows and arrows from the shops, as even a single point of extra damage from a bow or arrow translates to 75 extra damage. Next, I'll talk briefly about the skill Stealth. It's decent, although it can be tough to use. The main thing to know is that the darker an area is, the easier it is to pull off. This can be extremely effective, as you'll cross straight into an enemy's line of sight in some cases and they won't even notice, depending on how dark it is. Even in broad daylight though, you can still get a decent shot off from a range, but it's unlikely you'll get multiple sneak attacks in some contexts. Also, some enemies are stupider than others and will more easily lose track of you. It varies from enemy to enemy. Also, sound has something to do with it. I'm not sure exactly what, but if you stand still in some scenarios, you're more likely to get away with it. It's more than good enough for any of the stealth-related quests in the game, such as the Thieves Guild or the Dark Brotherhood, even with middling sneak skill, and so there's really no need for illusion or other forms of invisibility unless you run out of arrows or something. Because you're using Alteration for the feather effect, you also naturally have access to lockpicking spells. These are decent enough, but there are some doors that are bugged and can't be opened with these, so you will need to use the lockpicking skill at some point if you're doing stealth-based quests, so no avoiding that. Sneak is never perfectly powerful in the same way that invisibility or chameleon are, but it gets the job done if you have a strategy that supports it, sort of like this one. Speaking of which, it also benefits from chameleon, although chameleon is so overwhelmingly busted that I just didn't even bother using it at all. So you may wonder if this works with blade or blunt weapons, and it does, so technically you could use this trick to buff those as well. The first problem with that is that bows and arrows have the advantage of being ranged, but like I said, it's easier to dodge spells and otherwise survive in combat. The bigger issue is enemies with reflect damage, which is not triggered from ranged attacks. So if you were to do this and then hit an enemy with a sword, it will simply instantly kill you. So no matter what, you will be required to use bows and arrows at some point just to win the game. There are at least 3 enemies that you must kill that have reflect damage, but if you run out of arrows or something, I guess you could use a melee weapon as a fallback, but you're so fragile that it's probably not really a good idea at all, at least without illusion magic. To be honest, this is probably my favorite character overall, especially when you only fortify your fatigue up to 75 points. Sneaking around and one-shotting vampires feels very organic, and in my opinion, you don't really need anything else, which is interesting, because it makes me wonder if Bethesda knew that this was possible. By the time you start getting into 200 fortified fatigue, most enemies simply can't survive more than 2 arrows, depending on your bow and arrow, so if you want to just one-shot everything, custom fortified fatigue spells can pretty easily get you there. Now you can also fortify your fatigue with custom potions, custom enchantments, or sigil stones. One nice thing about this character is that it basically doesn't matter how you enchant your clothing, and your sigil stone enchantments can go wherever you like, or whatever is convenient for you. For example, it's just as good a decision to increase your magic resistance, or give yourself shield to make yourself resistant to physical attacks. By comparison, a high-level sigil stone is only going to provide you 50 bonus fatigue, which is still insanely strong for our purposes, but also won't really make you more durable. It just makes it easier to one-shot enemies, so it ends up being entirely up to you. Some enemies can still kind of be an issue. Enemies like Minotaur Lords or Umbra can still survive a good number of arrows, so I did end up fortifying my fatigue up to 200 points for them, but even Boethiah's Daedric quest was a bit of a joke. So the enemies that can give you problems are either really rare or just non-existent. For some crowded areas with tons of enemies, you may need to kite considerable distances or repeatedly transition between doors to pick enemies off. I did this in Kvatch and in the Bruma Oblivion Gate, for example, but it wasn't something I had to do too frequently, although it is a bit cheesy. By far the most troublesome quest in the game was the Great Gate, specifically the part with Martin, as Martin loves to die at high levels, so you may want to fortify your fatigue to at least 200 points, and hopefully that way you can keep the Daedra in check. 200 bonus fatigue ended up being enough for me, but I also had 100% resist magic as well, and some shield effects too, so you may need more bonus fatigue if you aren't immune to magic and resistant to physical damage. By comparison, Mankar Cameron was pretty soft, and I killed him easily with as little as 100 bonus fatigue, since he's a mage enemy, so no problems there. I expect that there are few if any quests in the game that you cannot complete, with the main potential exception being quests that raise your attributes or recover your attributes like I already said. All in all, This was a refreshingly fun character to play, even if the setup was a bit complicated. Sneaking around in 1 to 2 shotting enemies was pretty fun as a change of pace. Just don't forget the arrows, or otherwise you may have to break out the invisibility and backtrack. And I didn't even need any healing or mana potions or anything like that either throughout the whole game. I'd like to lastly give a shout out to the old knight. He was the one who taught me about this trick, so this wouldn't be possible without him, as well as the UASP and fandom wikis, of course. These were great resources for information, as always, and I couldn't do it without them either. Thanks for watching.